Today is March 13th, 2022. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche, Chistapomaki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S.-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw nations of the Stoney Nations, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina Nation. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mokinstis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act and Post status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. My father is so Canadian, I'm a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having an Indian Act and Post status card. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area of Clinchotine Indahe in Dene, meaning Many Horse Town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest, or in our case, invader, but acknowledging your role as a treaty partner, and that's what I try to do. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot Elder and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share what I know as I walk down the Red Road. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com. And a lot of you have always asked if you can send an e-transfer. That would be where you could, but I'd love to hear from you with your comments or questions. Also, giving a review helps from whatever medium you're listening. And I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. So I wanted to start today because this just popped up on my Instagram feed. It's something we've been doing kind of behind the scenes with the Reconciliation Action Group, is working with some different folks, specifically Migrant Alberta, Wept, and they're a group that wants to eliminate poverty. Reconciliation Action Group, the Alberta Assembly of Social Workers, Action Dignity, Justice for Palestine, Mexican Hungarian group, and one more that I don't quite know yet, but I'll try to get there. Anyway, I just shared it under Reconciliation Action Group called Unite Against Racism. It'll be Sunday, March 20th at 2 p.m. at the Peace Bridge. So please come if you can. That would be absolutely lovely and very relevant considering what's just happened in the last 24 hours. So as many of you have been listening to previous podcasts, we've been absolutely dragging the yellow vesters that turned into the trucker convoy. And now that's all done nationally. Of course, nationally, they don't recognize we've been dealing with this for years here. So there's been a few groups that were trying to challenge a new kid on the block, trying to challenge this whole convoy on 17th Avenue, otherwise known as the Red Mile for folks who are into hockey. This has been happening on the Red Mile, and literally people just have beer and watch Nazis try to go after a small group of people trying to stop their protest. And ironically, the police are absolutely aiding and abetting the Nazis. And interestingly enough, we've been saying this consistently for years, and yet going in one ear and out the other of so many people. And yet today, out of all days, I stumbled upon this on my Twitter feed. On my Twitter feed, there is a new Nazi group, and this new Nazi group is White White Lives Matter Alberta, and this was their statement that they made at 1:51. Self While self-proclaimed community groups are using their platform to spread dangerous and divisive rhetoric online, we want to take this time to applaud the Calgary Police for their integral work yesterday with maintaining the peace, which did not happen. Anybody who has seen any of the videos know it was the exact opposite. So it turns out the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good, which is supposed to be a group of Christians working on reconciliation, not only followed them, but yeah, that's one of the 3 followers. I swear to God, you try to work so hard with these groups and they just do everything they can to possibly hurt themselves while shooting themselves in their own feet on a regular basis. It's just so wild to me because, it's just one hand not knowing what the other hand is doing. I'm a part of the Indigenous advisory boards. You heard me a couple of episodes ago basically say that, you can't use these advisory groups, these committees. Us as members on these boards are trying to help the Calgary Police, and yet we get tokenized in a lot of these releases, these media releases, and we don't support your violence against people trying to stop these convoy folks. I mean, there is literally no regulations now. We're actually all getting sick. Um, the upswing is happening in Europe because we've released all these stupid mandates because you basically allowed all these bullies to win. And that's where we're at now as a society. And on Twitter, for people who care about science, if you follow a lot of the nurses, doctors, health professionals, they're saying 25% of kids who get COVID end up with long COVID. That's a pretty fucking scary stat, in my opinion, especially if you supposedly care about children, which a lot of these pro-lifers always claim to be. So that was really disappointing to read that, seeing the upswing in COVID cases. Now we have a new variant, like a BA2, that we're all dealing with. And the bullies won, and the police get to protect them. And there's video of it all over. And now you have white supremacist groups applauding the police and Christians happily following. Shocking. I'm not shocked. Any of you that are shocked just shows don't listen to my podcast, but you certainly don't listen to QT BIPOC voices in general. So another thing that we should probably talk about is the fact that the violence on Twitter, they outright said, one of our local activists, Adora Nofor, she was right in the middle, starting to dance. And that was when the police came in and got really violent with their bikes against the public. And, it's the end of the day, it just amplifies the racism. It amplifies how it's a white supremacist movement and how the police are part of the white supremacist movement by constantly protecting them. We've seen this long ago when Joey DeLuca and his crew were, screaming against our LGBTQ2 plus community here in Calgary. Guess who was there, and police were protecting them. And I'll give them props, at least they did it at City Hall instead of in the middle of the public where everybody is, being dramatically affected by this. But it's interesting watching the Beltline folks trying to deal with this, and I don't know what to say. I guess that's really up to them. I live in Abigail where Colton Crowshoe was murdered and the police didn't give a crap enough to investigate for 3 weeks. So, that's the problem for me. Lots of other things to discuss. One of the things I was lucky enough to talk about was the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People with the Liberal Party. I was actually invited to an event to talk with an MP who had to withdraw because they had used her parliamentary position, so that we actually ended up with 2 other folks that came in We also had a few MPs pop in as well and speak. So it ended up being quite an interesting conversation to be a part of. But I was a guest speaker to talk about, why I'm involved in such. So, just real quickly, they asked me the circumstances of why I got involved politically and with the Liberal Party of Canada. And I said that Indigenous in Canada are political by default. At the time of the birth of my daughter, I experienced systemic racism in the healthcare system, which was directly linked to my Indian Act being federal jurisdiction in a provincial healthcare setting. I had to heal. I went to counseling, tried to raise a baby, and attempted to reach out to my local Conservative MP and EDA, but to nobody's surprise, was ignored. In 2011, we had this dynamic PhD female candidate in our area that started a book club with guests like Tom Flanagan, Hugh Dempsey, Chris Turner, and she was so great at meeting folks where they were at. I wasn't sure about Michael Ignatieff, but by then I had unpacked a lot of my accumulated anti-liberal bias being born and raised in Alberta, and I really trusted her. This was a time that I was witnessing Stephen Harper's oppressive and racist approach to Indigenous peoples as the international vote against the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Equally, a former co-chair actually was really welcoming to me on the Indigenous Peoples Commission. That time it would have been the Aboriginal Peoples Commission. So they asked me who my inspiration and mentors are. And I said my granny, who survived 16 years at Sacred Heart Indian Residential Prison, my mom, who survived domestic violence, losing her children unfairly and forgiving the institutions and people that created the colonial violence against her, Ruth Skalplok, a local elder that founded Awuton Healing Lodge and spoke for decades on the issue of violence against Indigenous people at all orders of government, Josie Nipanak, the current executive director of Awuton Healing Lodge, for her work locally, provincially, and nationally on these issues of violence against Indigenous, and Canagis Manuel and Ellen Gabriel for their leadership of their inherent rights as land defenders. And of course, my daughter for the next generations, because this work is supposed to be to improve their life and the next ones coming up. Then they asked me how the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People has impacted Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. And I said, the Indigenous are known for their humor as a coping mechanism to intergenerational violence. And the short answer is, unfortunately, there hasn't been change between Canada and the Indigenous peoples and the so-called boundaries of Canada. And I wanted to encourage them to unpack why, that this is much bigger than just Justin Trudeau. Our audience needs to understand that we have 500 years of oppression and genocide, 500 years of being governed through patriarchy, and Canada trying to establish itself at the expense of Indigenous people with many Indigenous matriarchal governance. That's a lot of work to undo. So the corporate sector must not just recognize the purposeful exclusion of Indigenous people. They all see themselves as equal partners with Indigenous peoples and inclusion in business. It's a huge block because inherently Indigenous peoples believe in sharing wealth as opposed to Canada's profit hoarding system. We have completely different worldviews on economy, let alone things like land allocation and regulations of the land. Canada has a real opportunity to adapt its institutions of health, education, justice, and governance, and yet we have yet to see that work be done, and in some cases not even started. Aside from Vancouver, municipalities have yet to take meaningful action on Undrip, that's the acronym for the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Conservative-led provinces have outright contempt for Undrip. Just the other day, the U of C's public policy school used the term Aboriginal problem. So you can see, as in the truck convoy, the different orders of government weren't necessarily on board for cooperation for 3 weeks, let alone after, to work together on that issue of the truck convoy. Now imagine changing that to the three orders of government to equal Indigenous voices at the table. We need a fundamental shift in our society in regards to the approach of governance, economy, and social agency. In 2015, we campaigned on changing the first past the post system and couldn't agree about how to change it. I really recommend the book. It's a 2014 book called Tragedy in the Commons. Former MPs speak out about Canada's failing democracy, and it's written by Alison Lote and Michael McMillan. So until we see all orders of government on board with the 46 articles for Indigenous peoples within the boundaries of Canada, would we ever see any change other than the status quo? So that would be the real start of the weaknesses on Canada's part of the declaration. Another weakness is the real lack of Canadian law and legislation, and watered down through within legislation that does exist in jurisdictions like BC, where the provincial law recognizing Undrip, but yet the RCMP can still violently attack the Wet'suwet'en with no consequences. Having all orders of government pointing the finger at each other and the justice system. And ironically, they even have a 1997 Supreme Court case of Delagumuk on the side of the Wet'suwet'en. So, we have yet to see meaningful implementation of Undrip. But to build on that, the strengths of Undrip is that it is Indigenous led, and that all the solutions given are not just to Canada, but globally. Natural law and Indigenous inherent rights are kind of the base of it, and real meaningful implementation could literally solve issues on food security, climate change, economic challenges we are facing, and more instead of the non-Indigenous led sustainable development goals. Undrip would fix the inequality between Indigenous and non and honor the goal of the treaties. Another question I was asked was, what opportunities do you see in Undrip improving Canada's relationships with Indigenous people, and can you suggest anything to improve relations between the two? And I said that non-Indigenous people need a radical education. For years, I've pushed book clubs to help baby step folks into this new era of truth and reconciliation. When Canadians understand the treaties have not been upheld, the land has been exploited since French, British, and now Canadian interference, and recognize that the genocide is not just of Indigenous peoples, but also of the land and the animals, the environment, the ecosystem, then we can see how Undrip brings the solutions to actually share as the treaties intended while honoring human rights. The Liberals, I want them to imagine something beyond the next election under the Westminster system. I want them to be thinking of a newer democracy, a whole new way of doing elections, because, we've passed substantial legislation to allow for Indigenous self-determination and cooperation. So imagine the next generation of all our kids knowing Indigenous languages and ways of knowing. Imagine your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids living in a better relationship with the land as we tackle things like climate change with Indigenous solutions really on the front. So those were things that I really wanted to stress and amplify. So if you haven't read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, really that's the foundation of both the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report as well. So, the solutions are there. That's not a question. And of course we haven't seen municipally that be done, the justice system implemented to any sort of meaningful change. So we're just seeing the repeats of all of this again. And I'm so grateful that Adora, was, I can't even say that, safe. That's not true. I'm glad that her activism was recognized in that moment. But I know how traumatic it is being, having police. I'm 2 rows of police when we did the Wet'suwet'en solidarity rally in front of TC Energy. and having screaming protesters on the other side. I remember when I went to Smudge, they accused me of drugs. I remember them just screaming at me in general and us who were in support. And it's hard. It's not easy. So if you have a chance, like the activists that were there, absolutely support them. Unfortunately, lots of them live right there. So how else? Like, what else are they supposed to do? Um, and as opposed to these trucker convoys that come from all over, as you know, they don't necessarily live in the area even. So it's just gross. And tomorrow we have our book club on the Inuit experience, and geez, I just feel like I have so many things to tell you. I did witness something positive from the police, and again, this is like an example of the left hand not knowing what the right hand does. So you have like these riot police in city center District 1, and they are violent towards, you know, folks that believe in science and LGBTQ plus rights, and you know, they claim to be anti-racism for the most part, but some struggle with it. Anyway, you know, violence against these people was totally okay, and it just shows the allyship that the police have had with white supremacists, and it continues. Obviously, in that District 1, District 4, that's where they kill, you know, my relations, Black folks on a regular basis. And then up at headquarters, you know, we had an elder from Bagani give an eagle feather so that the actual out Indigenous officers, and it's not a safe place, so not all of them are out as Indigenous people. The ones that chose to swear on an eagle feather were invited to. And prior to that, the Bagani elder, he actually gifted Chief Mark Neufeld a name. And it was it was unexpected, and I know it wasn't a part of the agenda, but it ended up being quite um, important to say. And I think what people who might be listening is wondering why I would tell you this. And the reason why I have to tell you this is because my role when you witness ceremony is to tell others. And ironically, I haven't seen the Calgary Police put out a statement about it or anything like that. So um, basically, there was the elder. He was former chief of Bagani for 20 years. Leonard. He was in Bagani. He drove over to this hill. He was in Porcupine Hills, he said, and there was a huge flock of eagles, a huge flock. So he said that they all landed in the field, and he pulled over. He was with some friends, and they all witnessed this. And the eagles were in a circle, and in the middle was one. And when the one took off, all the other eagles followed. So that was the basis of his name, and his name is High Flying Eagle. So Chief Neufeld, his name as of March 2nd, his Blackfoot name is High Flying Eagle. And as a member of the Indigenous Advisory Board, it is my role as a witness to tell. And ironically, we had all of these, you know, allies in their ribbon skirts or, you know, moccasins pretending to be allies. And yeah, I don't know if they really understand their role when they witness these moments. Ultimately, it was ceremony that is meant to be told, just as Nenshi, when he got his name, one who moves camp and others follow. I thought that was such a great name. Sutina had given Justin Trudeau a name, and one who keeps trying. So I thought that was fitting. And I can't quite remember some of the other politicians and their names that they've been given, but I know Nenshi was given a second name, and I can't remember it offhand. I'll have to look that up. These are in our tradition, we have to tell stories of what we witnessed, so other people know that this is what has been happening. So I thought it was important for me to tell that story and go from there. I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and cultural safety training, cultural first aid, and all of them to talk about creating safer spaces for Indigenous people, color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. If you were to go to heretohelp.bc.ca, what is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it, you would find an article by Cheryl Ward, a Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fritkin. Ironically, there are so many articles out there, but their work and those cultural action tools I've said over 100 times in this podcast. So please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understanding. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Oh, internalized racism and lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized people experience by the structure of racism. I think I'm going to expand a little bit on that. I recommend Donna Bevan's work, What is Internalized Racism? But I also recommend that people look into what is called trauma bonding and understand that right now, at this exact moment in time, we have a threat of nuclear war. Ukraine is being invaded by Russia. We have the global pandemic with politicians catering to white supremacists. We have, an economic collapse in so many ways because of the pandemic. So many of us who are already struggling are struggling beyond measure financially. So with that, I will say I have been sharing a GoFundMe for a friend, Shiloh Clark, and another friend, Evan's Yellow Old Woman. I've been sharing those. I hope if you have some an opportunity to donate to them, that would be much appreciated at the very minimum. Please share that GoFundMe. We've been really affected by so many things. It's hard to listen to like the CBC radio because on there they're talking about, the economy coming back and oil prices are high and jobs are good. And that's not what marginalized people are seeing. And I'm not seeing that at all. In fact, I'm seeing the entire population, not just marginalized people, taking huge wage rollbacks. And then just recently, the UCP came out with more wage rollbacks that they want of the public servants who are just helping us out of this health crisis. So it's just so demoralizing because they all get away with it. They can get away with it. The oil companies are making hand over fist and the jobs aren't there. And they're certainly not paying what they used to in any capacity, despite the fact it's ridiculous, the prices right now. So, it's just really hard. So to get back to what, lateral violence is and internalized racism, we're already way beyond with our trauma being out there and exposed. And it doesn't take much because we already don't trust anybody for us to really start attacking each other. So for folks who see that, when we have internal conflicts, for you to amplify any of that in a negative way, it's just so heartbreaking. And we watched on TikTok, the concept of lateral violence, I don't think white people understand because here we had this white woman go after a Native man and a whole huge white following of white feminists being like, oh, he's such a dirty guy. And no concept of the oppression dynamics and their privilege that they've benefited from by the genocide of Indigenous people. Now, the Indigenous people have called in him. We will take care of him. But for white people to do it is actually a huge form of racism and violence. And ironically, they don't see that. Ironically. So that has been really eye-opening. You have somebody like this Chelsea who's supposed to be, educating white people on how to be anti-racist. but not only not doing it herself, but clearly failing her so-called demographic. So she's a shitty ally. We had another so-called an ally happen up in Edmonton, and I had learned a few awful lessons and the consequence of losing a good friend as a result. Um, I put out a public apology. That was it was vague because I obviously don't want to hurt and name that person that I've already hurt. And then secondly, my community will call me in to deal with that. So that will be dealt with. My mistake that I made that hurt this person so deeply. Um, but that said, non-Indigenous, um, you don't get to make the situation worse. Racialized, non-racialized. If you're non-racialized, you don't get an opinion on this. And in fact, as a result of what happened, I had blocked two other problematic white activists who would, constantly hurting and hurting and hurting me and others in the community. But this is my biggest learning experience was if people feel safe to badmouth someone to me, then I'm problematic. So I blocked two white activists that we should be aligned in, but we're not because they have outright, said negative things about people that I love and care about. And I've tried to baby step them to see that the dynamic, the power struggle, and they're committed to not seeing it. And one even tried to say that he was suicidal, which he may very well have been, but of course he ended up being just fine. So, it's back to that trauma being exposed. So, I've shared articles in the past that obviously he didn't see or others didn't see that talk about if you're white and you have unresolved trauma, don't bring that into activism because you're hurting yourself, you're hurting us. And that's exactly what has happened at a huge scale of TikTok with the Chelsea Lance drama, but then at a smaller scale, it's happening locally and provincially. So, I absolutely encourage people when I'm probably one of the lower points in my life, but that never gives me an excuse to hurt others. So I encourage anyone listening, if you take responsibility for the hurt that you are projecting, that you do of other people. I'm trying to make amends the best I can. I've never claimed to be perfect, but I'll never allow that to be a reason to hurt other people, and and not take responsibility for that. Ironically, I wish other folks in our community would take responsibility for hurting others too. And one last thing I'll say about that entire situation is that, one of my poor um, moments of judgment was thinking that I could somehow, bring in an Indigenous man trying to reconnect, but that wasn't my place because of my friendship with um, the ex, and that if he is meant to reclaim who he has community, he has aunties, he has uncles, but I was supposed to be a friend to his ex first. And I say that because, the bottom of every list is racialized women, and me not showing 100% solidarity, even when we, it's never our LGBTQ2 plus, our women. There's always gendered violence, always, always, always. And and as somebody who's supposed to be a spokesperson for women facing violence, for me to have not seen that to begin with was one of the worst errors of judgment on my part. And I am so sorry to my friend, from my former friend, that I was lucky enough to call a friend. I really encourage folks to take responsibility in the best way they can. And of course, the consequence of my um, error will always be losing that friend. But here's the thing, regardless, it was still my fault. I hurt someone, I hurt them deeply. And not just that I hurt them, it's that you claim and I claim to care about violence against women, violence against Indigenous women, violence against QT BIPOC, and I made this mistake. So I bring all of this up because, my trauma has been out there. Everybody's trauma is out there. We all have very little patience for all the incredible things that we're under. But never, never, never let that be a reason to hurt others. So to the Indigenous community, to the Black community, to the activist community, to the community of violence against women, all of these different gendered violence, all of these different groups, like, I'm sorry I let you down too. And I hope that I can make amends. We don't really have that restorative justice set up the way I wish we did, but I know in time I will take my lickings, not just from my colleagues, my friends, but my aunties, my community. They will take care of that too. And I will have to work at making those amends, which is part of the reason why I thought it was important for me to talk about the positive things that I had witnessed from one of the Begani elders. And again, that's my role as a treaty partner as well. I'm here on stolen lands, and I witness Indigenous ceremony. It is important for me to explain what I see. So with that, I'm also enrolled in Carrie Moore's next brain trauma workshop, and I'll be trying to, do that personal reflection. Like, we talk about healing journeys ongoing, and this is a part of it. And anyway, I hope that concept of, internalized racism, lateral violence, and the structure of racism on top of, trauma and the incredible situation we're under, all of that makes sense as to why it is racialequitytools.org, those resource files, the ongoing healing that we all have to do as community members, why all of this is relevant and goes together. So thank you, Donna Bevins, for that resource, and hopefully others will find healing in that as well. Oh, also do's and don'ts for bystander intervention for American Friends Service Committee. Boy, I should look into that deeper and see if it has a whole new special woundland section about how to not be a really shitty ally. Anyway, Indigenous have been talking about our issues, traumas in our reports, commissions, public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties, listen to politicians and their policies and platforms if they don't recognize marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities. Know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform, violence prevention programs, the 231 calls to justice of the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit, and of course Undrip, as I was talking about earlier today. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational, justice, and health institutions, with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism, they literally have zero business running. It should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, sports clubs. A great article I said out loud was Truth Before Truth, How Non-Indigenous Canadians Become Allies. Literally, if you were to Google how non-Indigenous Canadians become allies, you would see oodles of articles, not just that one. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today and want to talk, call the First Nation and Inuit, Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. It's toll free, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can also text at hopeforwellness.ca. For more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, call 844-413-6649. It's toll free, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And non-Indigenous, you can call distress center lines in your area. There's usually a functioning 211, or you can also call 833-456-4566. The 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta, ssisa.ca. If you're seeing or experiencing racism, you can also text or go to Act It End Racism. Text at 587-507-3838 if you see or experience racism. Also, the Trevor Project. Oh, we should talk about that real quick. For folks who aren't paying attention to what's happening in the States, some awful things are. The biggest one is the targeting of trans youth in Texas. And the Trevor Project obviously has lots of resources in general for those, but I don't think I can quite stress enough, targeting trans people is going to kill them. And I can't stress that enough. By denying trans people who they are, we are literally giving them death sentences. And it absolutely has to be stopped. If this was brown governed country, our white supremacist country West country would call them out. But it's right here. You know, Jason Kenney's bad for this already. And yet there's such a double standard when it comes to brown governance in another part of the world because of racism, obviously. So you have to start calling this out. Missouri has gone after uteruses. And if you have an ectopic pregnancy that literally can kill you, they'd rather see a dead woman than to allow an abortion. So that's disgusting. And ironically, the so-called fucking white power, white race folks, like literally are killing their own white women. I don't even know how to have this conversation of how hypocritical our society is and how they allow this stuff to continue. So please support the Trevor Project. And again, those resources are available for LGBTQ2+ youth, peer support work as well. So please go to lifevoice.ca and see the crisis supports as well. Normally I give a plug for Kids Help Phone, but I'm not going to today because I've actually found out some awful stories about how they treat some of their own staff. So I don't think I'll be promoting Kids Help Phone anymore, even though some folks may find them good, and I did when I was a child. But, you know, again, there's something I've learned from the hurt that I caused my one friend. It's that promoting something else that's harmful isn't helping anybody. So I'm not going to continue promoting it in any capacity. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. That's why I started this podcast. To speak freely without interruption, without tone police, without leadership shaming, without gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinion, but sure want to tell us theirs. Usually by people who don't know anything about us, know anything about colonialism, the constant surveillance of Indigenous people, our protests, our rights, our vigils, microaggressions, people dealing with internalized racism, people who are gatekeepers. So gatekeeping is, I feel like I live in an Orwellian world where if you believe in white power and white supremacy, gatekeeping means one thing, but when you're racial, gatekeeping means a completely opposite of the other. So, God, I can't stress enough doing anti-racism work. Recently came across a progressive that I had to block. Two of them actually in the same conversation. And they're so damn proud of their Canadian flag. And I can't stress enough that nationalism is white nationalism that absolutely leads to genocide. And we are already in a genocide and continuing on a genocide. and the so-called progressive told me basically to get over it. And it's public for everybody to see on Twitter, but it's amazing how it always gets missed. So I don't know what to say, friends. I don't know. Um, anyway, internal, external racism is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. And I want to say thank you to my ancestors, my granny of my granny and my mom of what strength looks like through their example. My dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt. My stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family roots. And teaching me to be a proud Calgarian is through her. I'm a second generation proud Calgarian, but I highly recommend if you are not an Indigenous person to never call yourself a native Calgarian. I literally named it to make fun of you. And that goes for any other city that you live in North America. Calling yourself a native whatever is stupid, racist, and you don't even know it. Thank you to my husband for producing and editing the show. On top of being my husband, my childhood friend, and the father of our child, he has supported me down my journey of the Red Road, witnessing decades of racism and sexism. And to a child we are blessed to learn from daily, we are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. My hope is that my daughter and my family will be proud of us trying to discuss these present day issues in a way that they can understand. Again, my Patreon account is Native Calgarian that you can pledge and support. Thank you to previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those that cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. And I also have a YouTube channel where you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And I just wanted to kind of just laugh a little at the very end and let people know I put up a poll. And I asked people what was the lie and what was the truth. And the lie was I had gotten a degree from the University of Calgary. And I know that was the highest number. And I know my people on Twitter are not the people who listen to this podcast. Because in previous podcasts, I talked about the education journey I'm constantly having to dissect and go through. So that was really funny. And then for folks on my podcast, you probably don't watch my Twitter. The other two truths, though, that I had told, because a friend of mine had inspired me to do this, the truths that I had told were that I had met my husband in grade 4, and that I really do hate the sound of bagpipes, like immensely hate the sound of them. And in fact, when people mimic it, it makes me pretty much want to die. So I'm quite easy to torture if you're not sure about that. And I want to end with giving side eye to the Calgary Rabbits. You're lucky I'm not Tradish. My beautiful cousin responded, or you'd be in my dish. Thank you so much for listening.